Hello everyone, welcome back to my Form 5 Ethics class at St. Anselm's Abbey School. In this video we're going to take a look at question 19, Articles 3 and 4, in which Aquinas finally gets around to showing us how we're going to measure the act of the will as being good or bad. Now the way he does this is a little funny. Remember that in Article 1 he's shown that the act of the will is good or bad by its object. The object is what makes it good or bad. And in Article 2 he argues emphatically, and in more than one way, that it's only the object and nothing else. It has to depend on just one thing, first in genus, all of that from the previous article. So in Article 3, when he asks, does it also depend on human reason? It's a little exasperating. It seems like a completely superfluous question. However, you already know the answer to it. We've seen it many times. And Article 3 is really just consolidating lots of things that we've said about intellect, really from the very beginning of the course. Article 3 is quite easy. We're going to fly through it. And in fact, Article 4 is pretty easy too. The key is we have to see the way the two articles are related to each other. And if you see those two articles clearly, then what we do next in Articles 5 and 6 will be a lot easier, or at least a little bit easier, because they're pretty tough. So the Article 3 objections, we're not even going to look at them up close. I'm just going to give you the quick summary over here on the left. In some way, all three objections are talking about the way in which the will is first. It holds some sort of logical priority in one way or another. And since we've already established that the will is good by its object, why would we go look at something else, anything else? We're already at ground zero, so to speak. The first one comes straight out of Article 2. And really all of them you could just reduce to, what about Article 2? Didn't we already say it's only the object of the will? Why on earth would we look at anything else? It's also the easiest Respondeo ever. You don't even need to read it. Close your eyes for Article 3. Assuming that you've done all of the previous work in this course well, this part's trivial. As stated above in Articles 1 and 2, the goodness of the will depends properly on the object. Now, the will's object is proposed to it by reason, because the good understood is the proportionate object of the will. Now, I'm going to stop reading there because what comes next for the next few lines is actually a little bit of a tangent for what we're looking at here. Aquinas contrasts the way the sense appetite and the rational appetite have different objects. So if you wanted to talk about the difference between wanting a cheeseburger and wanting friendship, then this would be the kind of thing to look at. This is the difference between not only different levels of human wanting, but humans and non-rational animals. But right now, we don't care so much for what we're looking at. What we care about is that conclusion at the end. Because the good understood is the proportionate object of the will, therefore, the goodness of the will depends on reason in the same way as it depends on the object. I've just listed over here on the right a slew of places where we've talked about the good understood. It's not the object as it exists in itself that matters. It's the object as it exists in the intellect. The good that moves the will is a being of reason. It exists in intellectu. That's it. That's Article 3. How easy was that? The conclusion of Article 3 is that human reason is the measure of the act of the will. It's our reason that makes our will good or bad. When reason proposes a good object, an object as good, and we will it, our will is good. And when reason proposes an object as evil, if we will it, that's evil, that's bad, don't do that. And that really does mean, if you think it's good, it's good. That sounds wrong. Yeah, don't stop here. Stopping in Article 3 would be a disaster. This is definitely part one of a two-part treatment. You have to go on to Article 4. Otherwise, you get stuck with a pure relativism. Well, what if you think theft is good? What if you think genocide is good? It is true that, well, you think it's good and I think it's bad, and that's a fact of life. People do disagree. And it is reasonable to say, well, it seemed good to me. That's all true. But it would be really nice if we could say, you think that's good and you're wrong. And when you do that, that's bad. Don't do it. So how are we going to solve that problem? How are we going to get away from this pure relativism? If human reason is the measure of our action, It sounds like man is the measure of all things, and Protagoras wins, to revisit an older Platonic dialogue. Well, we go to Article 4. That's how we solve this problem. Article 4 is going to show us a really important set of ideas that will solve all of this all at once. In fact, there's something magical about the way Aquinas' ethics sort of springs into existence in this. We're going to suddenly go from reasoning about really fundamental aspects of human nature and what we think and what we want, and suddenly we're going to have a full-blown theological ethics, Catholic ethics. You're going to need to be aware when you're reading Article 4 that Aquinas moves interchangeably between a couple of expressions, which we'll explain as we go through the rest of the course. Sometimes he's going to say eternal law, and sometimes he'll say interchangeably with that the divine reason, and I think once the divine mind. Eternal law is a really important topic for what we're going to look at later, because we want to talk about law more broadly speaking. But essentially what we're looking at in Article 4 is not just what humans think and judge about their actions, but what God thinks and judges about their actions, the divine intellect. So I'll always tend toward using the divine reason as my terminology here in Article 4. You just need to be aware that the phrases are being used interchangeably. And when we say that what does God think about the action, we don't mean it the way what does your friend think about the action, or what do your parents think about the action. God's intellect is, along with his act of the will, what created the universe. God doesn't learn or opine. God's knowledge causes the things of the universe. So in some sense, this idea of eternal law is just another way of saying what's real. What is really the case? Okay, you think this, fine, but what's really the case? Is it really good? This is Aquinas' way of saying that. You could think of the divine reason more platonically as just the moral blueprints of the universe. Broadly, it's just everything God thinks. It's all of the divine ideas, the architecture of everything. But here, for ethics, especially when we say eternal law, we mean the moral blueprints of the universe. What is good for us because of the way God has created us, and what is not good. So we're going to spend a good bit of time with that. You're also going to see a very famous definition of sin given by St. Augustine, and that's one to file and never forget. You're going to want to memorize that one and use it often. We will use it several times in the future. I've actually taught it to my Form 3 students before, so hopefully it's familiar. It's a nice sed contra. But as I said a few slides back, the Article 4 Respondeo is quite easy. It's not a difficult article. In fact, a lot of the magic here comes from the objections and the way they relate to the response. So let's look at those objections, which I love. All three objections are talking about what it means to measure something. And all of them are drawn from Aristotle's treatment of measure in Metaphysics Book 10, which is part of his discussion of the transcendental of the one, the indivisibility of being. You have to know all three of these. The reply to all of them matters in one way or another. Some of them are quite easy to answer once you've seen the Respondeo. They all are, I suppose. First objection. This is probably the hardest one to get a handle on. There's more than one way to tackle this one. It would seem that the goodness of the human will does not depend on the eternal law, so obviously it does. Because to one thing, there is one rule and one measure. But the rule of the human will, on which its goodness depends, is right reason. So the goodness of the will doesn't depend on the eternal law. Right? If everything that's measured has just one measure, well, we've already found it. It was Article 3. We've already shown that human reason measures are the act of the will, so we're done. Why would we look for another measure? Why should we think this objection is correct? That's a little trickier. Really a question of how deeply you want to get into what's going on in the introduction, the early phases of Book 10 of the Metaphysics. Even Aristotle himself and Aquinas' commentary on it, they both discuss explicitly when you measure something with two things. So it's possible that you should just read this objection as existing solely to get to the reply. I don't think that's quite right, but that might be the case. The best explanation of what we mean by one thing, one measure, is actually going to sort of lead directly into the answer. Possibly the objector is misunderstanding the role of one in this whole treatment of the metaphysics, possibly, which is really interested in unit and unity and reducing things to a unit measure. You should see the word one in unit measure, right? One of something. But you might think of the objection something like this, which is taken from Aristotle. When you measure something with two things, for example, you measure the diagonal by the two sides, whether you're talking about squares or rectangles. You measure the diagonal by the two sides. So that's true, but the two sides are also reduced. They're also measured by the unit length. So you end up with just one measure anyway, it would seem. It would probably help if you approached irrational numbers differently than you do. If you thought about it more the way Aristotle did, maybe this objection would be a little bit clearer to you. Anyway, well, the answer to this will resolve a lot of things. Maybe we can talk about what on earth is going on in class. If you want to dive deeply into Metaphysics Book 10, we can, but not in the video. This one should be a lot more intuitive. And actually, I think objections 1 and 2 are very similar to each other. So if you get this one, then don't worry about the first one as much. A measure is homogeneous with the thing measured. And homogeneous just means same kind. It's the same kind of thing. Well, the eternal law is not the same kind of thing as the human will. In fact, God isn't a kind of thing. This is one of those divine attribute issues that we talked about back in Form 3 when we talk about divine composition. God's not a member of any genus, so how can he be homogeneous with anything? The eternal law and the human will are not the same kind of thing at all. And so the eternal law can't be the measure of the human will. That's insane. When we say that a measure is homogeneous with a thing measured, we mean something really basic. Just that you measure a distance with a distance. Right? If I want to know how far it is someplace, I'm asking for a distance, I'll measure it with a distance. The measure is the same kind of thing as the thing measured. You measure a weight with a weight. All right, well, eternal law, not the same kind of thing as us. Not a kind of thing in the first place. So that's not going to work. Objection 3, probably the one that resonates most personally with my students. It's a great one. A measure should be most certain, certissima. The eternal law is unknown to us. We don't know it. How could we? Therefore, it cannot be the measure on which the goodness of our will depends. So we do care a lot about certainty when we talk about measurement. Just think about the standard kilogram that we store in a vault in France, right, by which we compare all other kilograms. That's what a kilogram is. It's that thing. Or you think about the way in which we define lots of these things in terms of completely impractical but theoretically precise measurements, like a distance being measured in terms of the oscillations of a cesium particle or whatever. Aristotle talks about the difference between practical and theoretical certainty. And that might be important for talking about ethics, for how we go forward with this. What kind of certainty are we talking about here? It's only in the realm of number or of geometry, say Euclidean geometry, where you can have a kind of theoretical certainty, where measure is perfect. When it comes to measuring weights or distances, or really of any kinds of things in the material world around us, we're really just going to go with a practical measure, right? A point at which the difference doesn't matter to us anymore. It becomes a rounding error, or it becomes imperceptible to us. So it doesn't really matter if the weights that I'm putting on my deadlift are really perfectly in alignment with the magical kilogram in France, the standard kilo. If it turns out that those 45-pound plates are in fact 45 pounds and about a half an ounce, that's not relevant, even once I start stacking up a bunch of them. I ran 3 miles today. No, you ran 3 miles and 2 feet. 2 feet doesn't matter. You can think about it in terms of significant figures, but even that turns it into something more mathematical than what we're really interested in here, which means something practical, right? We need a kind of practical certainty. But either way, the eternal law is infinite. It's the infinite mind of this thing that defies human comprehension. So how can we know it at all? Aristotle even uses the divine mind as one of his stock examples for things that cannot be known when he's talking about the nature of knowing infinites and whatnot. You can't know the divine mind. Of course, he also thinks that you can't know the hypotenuse of the square, since he has that was his approach to irrational numbers. There's you're touching some kind of infinity there that you can't really know. We can come back to that another day. So all three objections talking about how we measure things and problems with how the eternal law could measure human action. And I think objections 2 and 3 drive it home the best. Sed contra. Augustine says that sin is a deed, word, or desire against the eternal law, but malice of will is the root of sin. Therefore, since malice is contrary to goodness, the goodness of the will depends on the eternal law. It's tempting just to take evil will or evil action and sin as synonymous. That's good enough for our purposes. That's not quite right. We are borrowing against the future a little bit. It's that the wickedness or the malice of our act of the will is the root of sin. This is just a little bit in the future. We only have to get another question or two down the road before we see this. But it is our standard definition of sin. And somehow all sin is this idea that it's rooted in malice of will. That's where we're going with this. So we're going to just take this one for granted. This one doesn't matter quite as much. Just our starting point for the Respondeo. The Respondeo, it's so easy we shouldn't even talk about it. Wherever a number of causes are subordinate to one another, the effect depends more on the first than on the second, since the second cause acts only in virtue of the first. It's first mover argument. Technically, it's more the second way, which I do not teach my students in Form 3, where we talk about God as the first efficient cause. But in my opinion, the first way and the second way are completely interchangeable in the way they argue. So if you think back to the way we talked about the way pure act is actualizing these intermediate movers, it's actualizing their potency to actualize the potency of something else to actualize until we finally get to an effect. All that nested chain of actualizations of movers that traces us back to the first mover. That's this language of subordinate and first and second. When I push the tissue box across the desk with a stapler, there really is a way in which the stapler is moving the tissue box. But in that series, I'm the first mover, and that stapler is only moving the box in virtue of what I'm doing. Well, human reason is caused. We're caused. We're an effect. We're a creature. So the way in which human reason is a measure is caused. God makes human reason be a measure. He's the first measure of action. And human reason is something like that intermediate mover, like the stapler in the stupid first mover example. So we really do measure our actions, but we are in turn measured. A caused measure, or prefer a measured measure. But it's really neat the way you only need to understand the first way or the second way in order to understand this article. That it's very simple if you do. The way Aquinas' ethics coheres with his physics and his natural theology and all the things he's done before, it's quite remarkable. I'm struck by it every time I read this article. Okay, well, let's make it explicit. It is from the eternal law, the divine reason, that human reason is the rule or measure of the human will, from which it derives its goodness. Hence it is written by the psalmist, many say, who shows us good things? The light of your face, O Lord, is signed upon us. As though to say, and this is Aquinas' commentary or gloss on it, the light of our reason is able to show us good things and guide our will, insofar as it is derived from the light of God's face, of God's countenance. So the first line there is just making explicit what we were saying on the previous slide. Right? The divine reason is the first cause. It's the cause of human reason being the measure of the human will. It is the first measure. And human reason is the second or intermediate measure. But we need to say something about this quotation from the psalmist. It's the first time we've had a properly theological premise in a Respondeo. Normally, and in fact, in my introductory video on how to read the Summa, I say as one of my rules, don't worry about the scriptural citations. You can just throw them out. Don't try to figure out what was Paul talking about there. How does that fit into the argument? Because it doesn't really matter. You can just work around them. But here, that's actually not quite right. Here, this is not just a throwaway, look how we're integrating to the faith tradition. This is actually a properly theological premise. Now, it's still the case that you don't really need to focus on the psalm part. You have to focus on Aquinas' interpretation of it. But when Aquinas says that the light of our reason is able to show us good things and guide our will because it is derived from God's face, our light is derived from his light, that's Aquinas' way of saying that we're made in the image and likeness of God. We are like God, as it turns out. Not in a genus species kind of way. We don't share a genus with him. That's impossible. But we have some kind of access. We have some kind of affinity with the divine mind because we have a mind made in his image. It's finite. It's fallible. Not just fallible, it fails all the time. But we are like him, quite mysteriously. And that ends up being quite important. Now, we're going to say more about this in one of the replies. So we don't need to focus on it too much here. But we're finally fusing this natural ethics that we've been talking about for forever at this point with our theological tradition. And the psalmist, and Aquinas' commentary on the psalmist, are actually just making the same point as we made in the Aristotelian language on the previous slide, that human reason is a measure derived from God. It's caused by God. He's what made our reason be a measure of our action. So before we get into the replies, we need to look at the conclusion and state this very clearly. We have two measures of the act of the will. We have a proximate measure, meaning near to the thing being measured, and that's human reason. And we have a remote measure. That's the divine reason, God's mind, what God thinks. That language of proximate and remote you should recognize from question 18, where we used it to describe end instead of measure. But that ends up being that's not accidental. The similarity there is very important. And the existence of two measures of a proximate and a remote, that's not unique to this divine human thing that we've got going on here. It's not just a matter of ethics and the way God measures all things. Proximate and remote measure shows up in all kinds of completely mundane examples, which we're about to use several times over. The measuring tape does measure the height of the wall or the width of the door, but so does the architect's design. Is that wall high enough? Or is that door wide enough? Or is that arch right? In one sense, can be answered by, I don't know, pull out the measuring tape. And in another sense, it can be answered by, I don't know, pull out the architect's plans. What does the architect say? What does the measuring tape say? One is approximate measure and one is remote. And they're both really measures. It is therefore evident that the goodness of the human will depends on the eternal law much more than on human reason. Just like in the first mover argument, the movement of whatever thing you're observing depends much more on the first mover than it does on any of the intermediate movers. And when human reason fails, we must have recourse to the eternal reason. And we're going to say a lot more about this, but I just want to emphasize the when right now. There's no conditional there. There's no if. It is inevitable that human reason fails. We know that it fails. And the oddity, and it's going to drive what we're going to do for the next few articles, the oddity is that not only are we aware that we fail, but we can be aware that our reason fails and still know the eternal reason or the divine reason or the eternal law. We still have access to it. And that's going to cause some interesting problems. But for here, just emphasize, human reason fails often, and we can have recourse to the eternal reason when it does. Let's look at the replies to the objections to clean it all up. So the answer to the first two objections is actually the same. It just has to do with the proximate and remote idea that comes up in the Respondeo. So The first objection was one thing, one measure. And both the way I tried to explain it in the objection and the answer here with the example of the diagonal of the square, they're actually the same thing. To one thing, there are not several proximate measures, but there can be several measures if one is subordinate to the other, with a remote and a proximate. Both the measuring tape and the architect's design really do measure the height of the wall or the width of the door or whatever, because they're not two disparate things. You get this nested relationship of one moving the other, just like you do in a first mover argument or in a second way. And really, that's also the right way to think about the sides of the square measuring the diagonal, but in turn being measured by the unit length that I gave as my explanation for the objection in the first place. That takes us too far afield into the nature of measurement, though. We shouldn't worry about that too much here. Same answer for the second objection, right? Second objector said that the measure and the measured have to be the same kind of thing. They've got to be homogeneous. And the answer is a proximate measure is homogeneous with the thing measured, and a remote measure is not. And again, both the measuring tape and the architect's design measure the height of the wall. The measuring tape is a distance. You could use obviously we could stop using distance if you like, but it is a distance. And so it is homogeneous with all the distances that it measures, the length of the wall or the height of the wall and whatever, the height of the building, the depth of the well. So the proximate measure of the measuring tape, it is homogeneous with what it measures. But the architect's design, the mind of the architect also measures, and it's not the same kind of thing as a distance. It's not a distance. It's not a wall. Now, I do wonder about the fact that I've consistently returned to an example where the remote measure is a mind. And that is worth thinking about. Is that remote measure always a mind? Bonus question. I'm not going to say it in the video. I'm actually not sure what the answer is. I have to think more about it. I have to ask a metaphysician who actually spends time with Aristotle's Metaphysics, Book 10. Now, reply to objection 3, we need to dwell on for a bit. Objector 3 said that a measure has to be most certain, certissimo, and we don't know the divine mind. How are we going to answer that? It's a great objection. It's a powerful one. Although the eternal law is unknown to us, according as it is in the divine mind, nevertheless, it becomes known to us somewhat, keyword, either by natural reason, which is derived from it as its proper image, or by some sort of additional revelation. And that's the magic word, revelation. That's where this really starts to this becomes the beginning of theological ethics. So we've spent most of this course doing a natural ethics. We've just been talking about what it means to be human, and we've been reasoning about things in a very Aristotelian mode, sometimes Neoplatonic too, but we've never really turned to revelation in any meaningful way. It's been very much the same kind of thing that we do in Form 3 with the divine attributes, right? We can know that God exists, and we can have some kind of limited knowledge about what God is by knowing what he is not. We cannot know what God is. We can only know what God is not. If you want to know more than that, when it comes to theology, what God is, God has to tell us. He has to share. He has to communicate. And that's where we get into, that's part of the good news of the gospel, that God actually cares enough to tell us. It's not just the gospel, it's what's incredible about what happens with Abraham and with Moses, with the giving of the law. This is a remarkable free gift, in some ways even more remarkable than creation itself. And both by reason and by faith in what has been revealed, we know about God. We know not only what he is not, but also what he is, because he shares with us. That's theology. Well, it works the same in ethics. Natural ethics has the same kind of pitfalls as natural theology. We can know things about the divine mind by reason alone, because we're made in God's image, because the human mind is some kind of reflection of the divine mind. A very feeble one, but one nonetheless. However, while there are certainly things that we can know about ethics that essentially all peoples agree on, or most peoples agree on, cultures throughout time, Lots of things we don't. Lots of times natural ethics is hard. It's unclear. Right? Every culture, in every time, in every place, they've all had their own blind spots and their own inabilities to see what's really good for us, and they teach what is bad. Ours is certainly no exception to that. And so we require some additional revelation to know the divine mind. If we want to know the meaning of life and how to act, we should really care about how to act. It's a little bit easier, I think, to dismiss the idea of revelation when it's just knowing some arcane things about God, like, divine attributes. Like, maybe you're interested, maybe you're not. But everybody should care about happiness and how to live. And what we're claiming here is that God has come down from heaven and given us the answers. And at the very least, that claim should be examined closely. But it also raises some interesting problems. All of the earliest art depicting Christ in the catacombs shows him as a philosopher, not just a philosopher, but the true philosopher, not one bandying about ideas on par with the other philosophers, but actually giving us the answer to the meaning of life, to what we are and how to live and how to act. It's very practical. It's not just theoretical. But the fact that he's given us the answers in some sense, but that we can only appropriate that through faith, we accept it through faith and not something that we can prove necessarily by our own reasoning powers unaided by divine assistance, means we get some funny conflicts. Now, the thing to emphasize here is just humility, I think. We know that we fail. But in the light of revelation, we get an interesting result. We can know that we fail, but when God tells us the answer, we know the answer. We know it in one mode of knowing the divine mind, we have failed. But God has shared the answer. And so we actually know not just that we fail often, but in this particular case, we're wrong. So if I think X is good and God comes down from heaven and says, actually, that's not right, then I'm wrong. And it's as simple as that. But now I know the answer, even though my own reasoning process doesn't see it. For Aquinas, when he talks about knowing good and evil or measuring our action, he doesn't just mean by natural reason unaided by revelation. When God reveals, we now know it. Once we become aware of divine revelation, once we are taught, now we know the answer. Knowing is not this purely natural sense for Aquinas. It's all the ways we can know. It's faith and reason, which is one of the reasons why we emphasize the importance of faith and reason in the Form 3 and Form 4 class. And speaking of the Form 4 class, this ends up being why we should care so much about claims about scripture and tradition and magisterium and why there's a church at all and teaching authority. That suddenly becomes practical, not just because we learn about the incarnation, but because we learn about how to live and how to reach our last end. And knowing that we consistently fail to do that correctly for ourselves means that we really need those things. We really need that divine assistance. And yet, there's still something quite strange about the fact that we can fail, we reason incorrectly, and God gives us the right answer, and now we're sort of left with, it's weird that we know it and yet don't know it at the same time. And that's what the next two articles are about. The next two articles are about what happens when these two measures, human reason and divine reason, when they conflict. And the way Aquinas treats this is very difficult. It's very famous. It's his treatment of conscience and what it is and how it works. And that is where we are headed. This video is done. So if you have any questions about Articles 3 or 4, you know how to get a hold of me. And in the meantime, good luck with your studying, and God bless.